I'm Warren Vanderhill with the Center for Middletown Studies Project on Muncie's Faith Communities. Today is May 3, 2017, and I'm speaking with Pastor Jerry O'Neill at Holy Trinity Lutheran Church. And I want to thank you for agreeing to participate in our project, but I want to begin by asking you if you would tell us about your personal faith journey.
Well, thank you for the opportunity to spend time with you. I'm excited to be a part of this project. My faith journey began back in Silver Spring, Maryland. I was baptized there at 6 weeks of age, but our family moved quickly to Asheville, North Carolina, where I grew up most of my years. I grew up Episcopalian and found a real deepening faith as I was involved in youth group and youth retreats. Even had a budding sense back in those days that I might be called towards pastoral ministry. And so I was continuing to deepen, even as I broadened my academic interests. I had strengths in mathematics and music. But when I graduated from high school, I looked at various universities, but my family has a lot of Army in its background. Mm-hmm. My grandfather graduated from West Point. My dad was in active duty before I was born, and then in the National Guard all of my growing up years. Had others in the family as well. Mm-hmm. And so West Point looked like a natural place for me to do my undergraduate studies. And so I went there and graduated in 1993. While I was there, very involved in chapel programs. I was cadet in charge of the Protestant Chapel Choir, was involved in the Episcopal congregation and in other ministries while I was there. Of course, there is no theology degree at West Point. Right. They're training folks to be line officers in the Army, and so I graduated with a dual degree in mathematics and foreign languages and was commissioned as a lieutenant in the Corps of Engineers, serving first at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, and then at Fort Hood, Texas. So I served 7.5 years, culminating as a company commander. But all of that time, I realized that the military was not the right calling for me. It took me years to really discern that fully because I felt a sense of family obligation and obligation, of course, to the soldiers as well that I was serving with. But decided to leave the Army in early 2001. And at the time, considered the possibility of going to seminary in the Episcopal Church at the time. But at that point, it was clear to my wife and I, we had a daughter and a son on the way, that it was not the right time for me to go to seminary. And so at the time, Georgia Tech offered me a fellowship to go and study operations research in their PhD program. And so I went down there and went through their program, did work in nonlinear optimization, and completed my doctorate in 2005.
Everybody, of course, understands what nonlinear optimization is. Okay.
Yeah, that's in operations research, mathematical optimization. And then but as I got towards the end of that, I realized, I loved the teaching. I was good at it, but my heart wasn't deeply in it. Mm-hmm. And so I reconsidered the possibility of seminary again.
So you were actually thinking of maybe being a university professor at that point?
Correct.
Okay.
Right. But when I realized that my heart just was not in the research, I decided to revisit the possibility of seminary. By that point, my wife and I had become Lutheran, ELCA, which Holy Trinity is. Right. And one thing I love about the ELCA is very close in connection to the Episcopal Church. We're actually in full communion with each other. Right. So we decided to look at seminary again. And I worked for a year after graduating from Georgia Tech at Delta Airlines doing math modeling. Yeah. And then came up to Trinity Seminary in Columbus, Ohio for my seminary training. Did continue math research while I was there at Air Force Institute of Technology and taught a couple of classes at Capital University. But I finished my seminary training in 2010 and then was called to serve Calvary Lutheran Church in Bluffton, Indiana, about an hour north of here. Yeah. Served there for 6 years and then came here beginning August of this past year, and our family has loved it here in Muncie and at Holy Trinity.
How would you compare this parish with your work in Bluffton, the parish that you served there?
Congregation in Bluffton was a good bit smaller. They worshiped between 60 and 80 on a Sunday. The congregation was, like this one, very caring, fairly welcoming. The community there was extremely conservative. And that was a bit of a cultural disconnect for my family and myself. And so as I came toward the 6-year mark, I began some time of intentional prayer and discernment to see, might God be calling me to consider something else. My daughter was graduating from high school, so it was a logical time to do it. And our son now is a sophomore, so we knew if not this past summer, it would be 3 years before we would consider a move. And it was clear in our prayers that God was saying, yes, be open to it. And Holy Trinity is not only larger, it's and of course welcoming, but it's very much vibrant with its music ministry, its worship style. Our histories fit surprisingly well together. My first experience at Holy Trinity actually was in May of 2012. This congregation at that time had 2 pastors, but towards the end of May, their senior pastor at the time tragically committed suicide. And my first experience here was at the funeral. I was one of the 50 or so pastors that was here for it. And my heart broke for them. Through that time, this congregation has done a lot of grieving, a lot of really fruitful grieving and healing work. I have to give credit to Pastor Tracy Paschke Johannes, who was the associate at the time, then stayed on as a solo pastor before leaving in March of 2015. She did a superb job in helping them walk through their grief. But that resonated. In the interview process, my first question to the call committee was, so how is the grieving process going? And there's really been a sense here since I've arrived that through that grieving, through that process of death, now new life and resurrection is beginning to emerge. And so that's exciting to see here.
Once you're in a Lutheran congregation in the Midwest, do you pretty much stay in the Midwest, or if you wanted to go to a different geographic locale, is that open to you?
We could be open to it. The ELCA, Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, is composed of 65 synods, SYNODS. They are geographically based for the most part and generally have around 200 congregations in them, headed up by a bishop and a bishop's staff. Generally, once you are in a synod, you stay within that synod, and you do call process through the synod office. But if I wanted to, I could put myself open, and then my bishop would need to have conversation with the bishop of whatever synod it was about that possibility. It does happen, but I would say the majority of pastors tend to stay within the same synod much of their
for a career
ministry.
What do you see as your main responsibilities here?
My main responsibilities here, first and foremost, involve worship and theological interpretation. Worship, shepherding the worship style, preaching is very important. Helping to select music and structure the liturgy, I think is an important piece of what I do. Theological interpretation, being that voice to ask, where is God in this? What is God doing? How is God at work here? One of the things I've loved coming here to Holy Trinity is that there are others who are also stepping up to do that. So I don't have to be the sole voice asking those questions of God's activity among us. Additionally, I have role in pastoral care, visiting shut-ins, taking communion to folks who are homebound. And then there's also the leadership aspects of the congregation. working collaboratively to sense God's vision for us, where God is calling us forward, being open to God's call to change in our midst. That does not mean that I need to come in as a super strong change agent. In fact, I think that's inappropriate. I think it's best to notice, first of all, that God has already been at work among the folks here. And so my role is to walk with them in that process, as together we discern God's direction.
How would you characterize the condition of Holy Trinity right now?
I would characterize the condition as, first of all, resilient. What happened to this congregation over the past decade would have sunk other churches. Not only the situation with the suicide, but even further back, there was an associate pastor who had to resign from the congregation and from the ELCA roster. That was painful and divisive. So those circumstances could have, and they have lost some members, some worshiping folks in part because
that was my next question.
Yes, through that. But those that have stayed are deeply committed, and not just committed to an individual pastor, but to the ministry that we share. To a certain degree, I think that's very freeing for me. I personally find it troubling when people go to a church because of the pastor, because of that one person. I get the personal connection that they like, and they appreciate the preaching style and whatnot. But to me, our community of faith is far deeper than one person, and should be. And so the first thing I would say is they are deeply resilient. They are engaged. They're engaged theologically. Our adult Bible study that we have on Sunday morning is wonderful because everybody is engaged. Everyone's involved, asking questions, bringing up ideas and comments. So they're also engaged in the community. That's another piece that I see as part of my role is opening our eyes to see how is God connecting out in the community? How is God calling us to connect in the community? To see that God's already at work out there. We're not going to serve them, so to speak. God's already with them. How do we walk with them? How do we accompany them? And so, for example, we have an open hands feeding ministry once a month that gives food.
There are a lot of questions I'm going to ask you about the community, but that's a good tease right now. Because you really are very cognizant of being involved outside the walls of the church.
It can't, and it should not be just about ourselves. I will say that I think that's one place where the pastor's role and parishioners' roles are a little bit different, because my primary ministry is inward, ministering to, shepherding, guiding the people here by God's grace, where theirs is primarily in the community, daily work and daily life. But we all have those responsibilities, and if we only turn inward on ourselves, we're going to die as a church. We can't do that.
What have the membership numbers been like? I mean, was there a time with many of the mainline denominations in every community where there was kind of a high water mark? I mean, when we've talked to pastors of other mainline churches in Muncie, they will hark back to a time 20 or 30 years ago when they had X, and now, for a variety of reasons, they have Y.
Correct.
Has that been the experience of Holy Trinity as well?
It has been the experience of Holy Trinity, but exacerbated by our unique circumstances. This church is more than 125 years old. And I've only been here 8 months, so I'm hesitant to speak about the history, because what I'm speaking about is purely secondhand. But they started out as a relatively small worshiping community. They had a church on Howard and Liberty Streets, which is still there. It's now, I believe, is it Greater Grace Baptist Church or something like that? It was sold to them. In the late 50s, early 60s, a pastor by the name of Frank Stevenson worked with the congregation to build this new facility. It was obviously a major building project. And the church, through his leadership and pastors after him, Ron Levin in particular is one that's often mentioned by people, grew. Pastor Levin had a real gift for evangelism. He'd be knocking on doors routinely, going to folks around the community. And so the church grew pretty dramatically. It had 2 pastors under Pastor Stan Peterson. When Stan was here, Pastor John Malzahn came on as associate pastor, and for a long time they worked well together. And then Pastor Stan retired, I believe, around 2000, 2001. Pastor John then stepped naturally, was placed naturally into the role of senior pastor. And it was then that they called Pastor Joe Stark as associate. Pastor Joe was here about, I think, 7 years. He was the one who was asked to leave due to inappropriate behavior. Following him, they had a pastoral intern who had gone through seminary, had been a member here before she started seminary, gone through seminary training, did internship as a hospice chaplain, and then was asked to be the associate pastor. That was Pastor Tracy that I mentioned. That's one place where I think God's gifts are evident here, because she, with the hospice training and gifts, she was the one that was here during the grieving time. But it was then, it was Pastor John, tragically, that committed suicide in 2012.
But there were always for a very long period of time then, there were 2 pastors.
Yes, from basically the 70s, 72, 73 to 2012, 40 years, there were 2 pastors here. And the congregation was very, as I hear now, was very pastor-centric. People were engaged, but the pastors had to make all the decisions. And they had the numbers, especially in the 70s and 80s, to support it. They were worshiping in the high 300s, I think, at some point. And 2 services, very large and engaged. Numbers gradually went down over time, has been happening across all mainline denominations. But then were exacerbated, with Pastor John's suicide. And when Pastor Tracy was called, as a woman, I think that was frustrating to some. That she did not get a large share of the vote in our denomination's understanding. It was enough to be called, but some folks left, which I find really tragic. Again, making the church all about the pastor instead of the community. So I'm still connected with Pastor Tracy. We talk via Facebook and such, so that she's been very supportive. Of me.
What are your numbers like now?
We worship about 120, plus or minus on a Sunday. 2 services right now. The first service is smaller, but the second one often will have 80 to 100.
But it's the same service.
It's the same worship service, unless we have a baptism or something like that at one of the services.
No, I was just talking about other mainline denominations, which would not be true of yours. And that is what they've gone to is to have a contemporary service and a traditional service. Or a praise service and something else.
Holy Trinity did have a praise service for a time. They had a praise band, and then the band dropped back to doing once a month. And then at a point, I'd say 3-4 years ago, I think, disbanded. Some of it political squabbling and such as can happen. I'm not opposed to contemporary style worship. I'm open to various styles.
Well, you have a music background.
I do. I play piano and guitar. So, but yeah, they've gone to 2 fairly traditional style worship services. The choir sings every week. They normally sing at one worship service, so they alternate between the services. And then we do a kids' word if there are children present in the congregation. And at the second service, if we have kids, which we often do, we'll have children's church. So they will go out with an adult and do worship at their level and come back in time for Holy Communion.
Let me go back to the mainline churches and the loss of membership, which obviously is true everywhere in the United States. As you look at that, from a very, very different perspective that you bring to the pastorate, why do you think that's happened?
Well, I think there's a combination of factors. The honest, large-scale factor is that the wider society no longer sees the church as central. It's in the 1950s, church was the center in many ways of a lot of communities, especially smaller communities.
Right.
And so people went to church sometimes because that's where you made social connections. That's what you did on Sunday morning. There was nothing open and available on Sunday morning except that.
Good point.
And so there, to a certain degree, the church has lost its central standing within the society. I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing. I think when the church gets too close to the center of power, it can get co-opted and lose its prophetic voice that we need. And so it's not necessarily a bad thing that we've moved to the margins, but as churches, individually, congregations, we haven't done a good job adapting to that reality and helping people to see that church isn't just something we do. It's a way of life, but more than a way of life, it's central to our life. And it impacts everything we do. You know, this gospel reading for this coming Sunday, we use the standard lectionary, Revised Common Lectionary. John 10, Jesus says, "I have come that they might have life and have it abundantly." Yeah. And when we look around us at the world, I see folks who are running around harried, no time away, working 2 and 3 jobs, barely making the ends meet, struggling and wondering what the meaning of life is through it all amid the chaos of their lives. They have no grounding. They have no community around them in many cases. They might have some if they've got kids and they've got, the marching band community they're involved in with them, that sort of thing. But one of the gifts that I find here, we've got 2 ladies groups that have met for decades and have walked through the deaths of spouses, have gone on trips with one another, have routinely spent time in Bible study and prayer and the deep community that they have. I think one of the challenges for us is how do we help folks out there realize that this is something that's so life-giving that could be a gift to them, and how do we engage them in it? Part of the challenge is when you have such deep and long-standing connections within the church, it's very hard for anybody to get in from the outside. So maybe it involves recreating that kind of thing in a way that connects with folks on the outside. So there's a real sense that the community, the society has passed the church by, and that's true across denominations.
Yeah, true. Yeah. Is there a lot of pressure on you as a new young pastor to increase the size of the congregation?
I think there's a little bit, but in this setting, not so much right now. I think folks are excited by the new life that they're already beginning to experience. We've had some folks who had dropped out for several years, many of them grieving, I'm sure, after Pastor John's death, who have started coming back. And so we welcome that. We rejoice in that. One of the real gifts here at Holy Trinity for me is because of their history, they have a real focus on the pastor's self-care. How am I taking time away? How am I spending time with my family? Things like that. And so that deep pressure of, we've got to grow or we're going to die. I'm not sensing that anxiety right now the way we would see at other churches. Might it happen if things didn't continue to grow in future years? Possibly, but not right now.
Is that pressure there with the decline of membership in mainline denominations, specifically, of course, with your denomination, at the higher levels of administrative structure in the church? And when you think of bishops and people at that level?
Absolutely it is. I serve on the board of directors at Trinity Lutheran Seminary, my alma mater in Columbus, Ohio. And just as an example, we looked at a chart recently that showed the number of seminary students right now is down 40 to 50% from a decade ago. Wow. It's remarkable. And what has happened, I think, is over time, as churches have gotten smaller and grayer and older, the number of youth dropped off a good bit more, now those that are going to our Lutheran camps has dropped off for our middle school, high schoolers. Those going to Lutheran colleges has tended to drop off, or it's gone more ecumenical, which is a good thing. But then, therefore, there are fewer coming into seminary. And so it's a big issue across the church. It's facing the question of, can we afford the clergy that we've got?
Right. Yeah.
Can we afford to educate them the way that we have? Because seminary students are sometimes coming out with $40,000, $50,000, $60,000, $70,000 of debt, and they're coming into a ministry that they're lucky if they're going to start out at $40,000 a year.
Yeah, I know. Yeah,
So there's huge issues on that end, and do we change the way that we're educating our clergy? So yes, the wider church is very aware of it. There's trying. Our denomination's starting new ministries, especially in ethnic-specific communities.
Yeah, right.
So there are ways that congregations and denominations are trying to address it.
So, since you have background as a musician, I'm going to ask you this question. What do you think the appeal is of these large, and they don't have to be mega churches, because there really aren't any mega churches by definition in this area, the 2,000 plus definition. But the appeal of the praise-oriented service. I mean, what, as you see this as a piano player and a guitar player, what appeal do you see that there is in that approach to worship?
I think there are a couple of things that are appealing to them. First of all is that it is similar to what they experience in the wider culture. That's the kind of music you often hear on the radio, and on television. You see that similar visual effect. So there's certainly some of that that's going on. Additionally, the music is often simpler in structure, and so it's the lyrics stay with you. That's catchy and that sort of thing. You hear a song on the radio and it sticks with you through the week, type of thing. Where the older hymns were more often written to get some theological depth, turns of phrases and things that I find very meaningful, but often don't speak, I think, to folks who are of more of that. Additionally, with the larger churches, there is a simple appeal in the fact that people can go to worship and remain anonymous.
Yeah.
They can go, they can have an uplifting feeling in worship. People want to feel uplifted. I get that. We try to, as part of our worship, that's part of it. Not always. During Lent, it tends to be more subdued than it does during the rest of the year. But, there's a certain sense you want to go, you want to get an uplifting feeling just to help you out through the week and not have any responsibilities and just be able to leave. And with the larger churches, you can do that. With smaller churches, you can't get away with that because there are, first of all, not enough people. And to be honest, I don't know that's faithful to being church. The church isn't just what we do on Sunday morning. It's the body of Christ, and so it's all the ways that we interact and connect with one another. And that includes everyone from the youngest kid all the way to the oldest person, everyone in between. And so how do we get people more engaged and more involved, both in worship and in Bible study, in fellowship, in service, all the things that we do?
Well, that's a good point of transition, because the question I want to pose now is, what role do you see for this church in the wider Muncie community?
I don't know the full answers to that yet. We are beginning a process now that will probably take a year and a half, 2 years, if I had to guess, of visioning, of discerning where God's leading us forward as a community. Which, by the way, may lead towards a building campaign. This facility is old with lots of maintenance issues, and so that may be in the cards down the road. I certainly think, though, that we can have an even deeper engagement, not just as individuals, but collectively as a community moving forward. Might we have engagement with racial-based issues? One challenge for us here, located just on the north side of the White River, I think there's more of a divide than I realized coming here that the White River makes with downtown. And yet, the housing around us now, which used to be upper middle class neighborhoods,
Right.
is now largely transient student housing.
Yeah,
So it begs the question for us, who is our neighbor? What is our context?
Right.
To whom are we called to connect with? We've become more of a commuter church.
Yeah,
Are we called right to this neighborhood around us, in which case we're called to interact very much with the college students in the transient nature? I will say the college students that we've had worshiping with us enjoy being with us in part because we have a traditional worship style.
Right.
They like that deeper liturgical style worship. One thing about our worship style that I tell folks is we are not the audience in worship. In the praise and worship style worship, you come in and you feel like you're an audience, you're being entertained.
Right.
We're not the audience.
Right.
We are the actors, if you will, in this divine drama. God is the audience.
Yeah.
God comes to us also in worship, we believe, but God is the audience for our worship. And so we have active roles to play in it. All of us do. So, are we going to connect directly to the college students? I think there's a real possibility there, though our denomination also has a campus ministry
Right.
that we connect very well with,
Right.
Grace Village.
Yeah.
Is it the downtown community? Is it? Might it be, if we're really sensing a particular calling, that we move to be more in a particular context? I don't know. Given the realities of Muncie and the depressed economic state over the
Yeah.
decades,
Yeah, we're getting to that.
that may not be a possibility.
Yeah.
One thing I do think, if we do end up with a building process moving forward, I will encourage us not to simply see it as our building. How does it become a community resources?
Right.
Churches, by and large, are the least underutilized
right.
facilities in the community. They're used one day a week, sometimes half a day a week, and that's it. How might we be, have offices for the local Habitat for Humanity or the local American Red Cross or the local, who knows, ministries that could operate out of here? Might they pay rent, or might we offer that as free space for them to do their ministry? I don't know. Preschools, I'm not sure about. I don't know the situation here in terms of preschools. My guess is they're probably already saturated.
Yeah, you're
around here.
atypical, I will tell you, based on my studies, of a place that does not have a preschool. Everyone has a preschool.
Right, which means that market is probably saturated.
Yeah, well, I don't know. I mean, it depends on the location.
True.
But I mean, that's one thing that's really struck us as we've gone from church to church to church all over the geographic base of our study. You just take it for granted
Yes.
that places are going to have preschool programs.
Certainly.
Yeah.
So, but that's one thing we're thinking about is, who is our neighbor? Who are we called to connect with? And how do we go about doing that? So,
Yeah, I was really struck by your point regarding students who may want to go to a more liturgically based service rather than what they have on campus with the Revolution,
Right.
or if they could find the Common Way and all of these places around town, which are much, much more praise music oriented.
right.
Because that certainly is not the case here.
True.
And yet you would have a cluster of students, I would think, that might want to have that
Right.
while they're undergraduate students at the university.
Yes.
As you probably are aware, to shift just a touch, in the last few decades, and this has a lot to do with our project really, Muncie has experienced incredible economic and social change.
Right.
In what ways, as you see this as perhaps a new pastor on the block, have these economic changes impacted this congregation?
They've impacted this congregation profoundly.
Oh, okay.
Ways that we may never fully understand. But I would honestly say that the majority, I think, of the demographic changes in the congregation can probably be attributed to the changes in the wider society. Gil Rendell, in his book Journey in the Wilderness, says that by their analysis, 76% of the demographic changes are based on the wider context.
Okay.
And so, when all of these industries have left over time,
Right.
Delco, Borg Warner, on
Yeah,
and on and
well,
on.
yeah, you're talking about 15 to 17,000 well-paying middle-class jobs.
Right. And so those have disappeared, and we still have retirees
Right.
from those who
Yeah.
are here. But in terms of major industries in the area, we're basically left with Ball State
Right.
and Ball Memorial Hospital.
That's right.
So, one question for us moving forward as we seek to discern, what is our context, is what might that look like in the years ahead? Might we be involved in community organizing, community engagement? I read the study of the Normal City Riverside area. There were a
Right.
series of studies done. And the number one issue that the residents said was for this area is the roads.
Right.
Okay. I get that for college students whose
Sure.
main interaction is we're walking or riding bikes or riding cars back and forth.
Right.
How might we be called to create community, to build community, to make this a more desirable community, Muncie as a whole, so that industries and such might be attracted this way? I don't know the answer to that, and those answers are certainly beyond just my level, but I think it's part of what we need to be asking
Yeah.
as a community.
So there definitely have been members of your congregation who have been impacted by these economic changes of the last several years.
Yes, absolutely there have been.
Yeah, okay. Do you know any specific examples, without mentioning names, of people who have had their lives changed as a result of these economic difficulties?
I'm trying to think of folks that I know. I did a funeral for a gentleman back in the fall who had retired years ago from, actually I've done a couple of funerals for folks who've retired from Borg Warner
Yeah,
and places like that.
Right.
And, so those folks now up into their 80s died. But I'm not aware, though, of folks, for example, who have moved away.
Oh, okay.
But I imagine
Right.
there were probably quite a lot of them.
Yeah.
It was 20 years ago, and I haven't heard the stories.
Yeah, it's more a question of not just the working group. It's what was carved out of many of these churches, especially the mainline denominations, were middle management. And so you had people who were leaders in the church. They were below, let's say, the vice presidential level in the corporations, and there were many of them. And they were very involved in their church community. They were very involved in many aspects of life in the Muncie community. And it isn't that they lost their jobs, they were transferred.
Right.
As the plant closed, they got to go to, I don't know, Alabama or Kentucky or something like that. So it wasn't an income loss, it was a loss of the work that these people did.
There's loss of talent.
Well, yeah, exactly. And many of them in very important leadership positions in these congregations.
I believe it.
And all of a sudden you take that out of here.
Right.
I mean, we had one pastor say to us of a fairly large Baptist church that he figured he'd lost about 30% of the middle-aged leadership group that really played a pivotal role in the life of his congregation. And all of a sudden they were gone.
I would not be surprised at all. Here, I don't know. Maybe part of it's our location, but we have
right.
at least now, my sense is we have a fair number of folks who are connected with the university.
Oh, yeah.
Current teachers and retired
yeah,
professors and
yeah.
teachers. We've got a fair number of folks connected with the hospital, doctors, nurses, therapists,
right.
and others. And so we have some of that leadership. Now, like every congregation, our mainline congregation, ours has been getting older, graying,
Yeah, right.
and so more and more of them are retired.
Yeah.
But and not everybody is in those categories, but we've got a fairly solid talent pool. I'm grateful to God for
Yeah,
the
you
lay
do.
leadership we have.
Yeah.
That's another thing to when I mentioned Pastor Tracy and her work in doing the
Right.
grieving process. The other thing she did is she helped them transition to become more of a lay-led congregation. So instead of the pastor having to make the decisions, they could make the decision, step forward, and take the ball and run with it. And I give her credit for that. That's a gift to me. I see myself as an encourager, an equipper. I don't see myself as having to be the decider in chief.
You're not the captain.
I've done that job. I don't need to do that.
That was my point. You're not waiting for them to salute.
Exactly.
Could you give me some examples? You alluded to a couple earlier in our conversation of programs that your church is involved in now in the community? I mean, you mentioned in passing, I know.
Sure. Well, a couple that I can mention right off. We do every month a feeding ministry called Open Hands, where we just open it up on the third Saturday from 9 to 10 a.m., and we have bags of non-perishable food that we hand out to whomever comes. We normally hand those out to about 40 a month. So that's been going for some time now. We also, at Thanksgiving and Christmas, we do an expanded ministry. We work with the Salvation Army to get names. And so we expand it to include, a Thanksgiving turkey breast, a Christmas ham, that sort of thing, to make it a much larger. It's not just one bag of food; it's like 4 bags. Right. And the congregation gets very involved with that. We're really involved with the Salvation Army bell ringing, have been for years. We, 25 plus years ago, started a joint ministry with the Lutheran Church of the Cross, which is a fellow ELCA congregation, and First Presbyterian Church, called Project Stepping Stone. This ministry provides, we have 3 homes that we own that provide temporary, rent-free, utility-free housing for folks needing a leg up to get hopefully out of poverty, get into a better life. And so we've been doing that for more than 25 years as a congregation. I'm trying to think other ministries. We also have a group. Every year we send a team down to Biloxi, Mississippi for a week of rebuilding homes and things like that. We're beginning to do some work with Muncie Mission, doing that same kind of work here. And so that in addition to what individuals are doing. The other new ministry that we have going, we've joined in Ball Memorial Hospital's program, the Community Health Alliance. They're working with different organizations, nonprofits in the community to encourage healthier living. And so we have a walking group that meets on Wednesdays. I normally join them when I can. Today I was in a meeting, as you know, so I missed it. But we're also, we have flyers up and posters and things. We're considering doing other work with it as well, like a smoking cessation group and things like that. Dietary stuff to encourage healthy eating. So
it would be fair to say that you're doing a number of programs now, and you anticipate doing more in the future.
Yes.
And this is something where you get really solid buy-in from the members of the congregation?
We do. We get solid buy-in. In fact, of all the ministries here, I would say the outreach ministries are probably the most active and involved. I was stunned when I came here, when I met with our Ministry of Outreach, that I told them the number and type of ministries that they're doing I would expect from a congregation twice their size. And in fact, one of my concerns is, and it may be that it's because the congregation dropped in size over time, but they've kept those up. I want to be careful that we don't burn our lay people out in those ministries. Now, if they're being fed by them and excited, engaged in them, people get burned out when they're not working in an area that they're feeling gifted and called. It's not because they're working hard. But I want to be aware of that. If folks are beginning to get burned out in a ministry, might that be time to let one go, to consider something else?
Do you find that people in your congregation really understand what it means to be a Lutheran?
I think they understand more or less. Some folks maybe don't know the theology as deeply, but they're getting what it means, more importantly, to be a Christian.
Oh, okay. Fair.
I tend to hold the Lutheran title lightly myself. I think that our theology is really solid. The theology of grace, the willingness to see the world as it really is, the theology of the cross. And so that I think comes through in the preaching and teaching, but if you ask them, could they recite from Luther's Small Catechism?
Right.
No, most of them probably could not.
Okay.
To be honest, I probably couldn't fully.
Well, I mean, I
could
laugh
read bits
about
of it.
that because, coming out of a Dutch Reformed Calvinist background and being a member of First Presbyterian, I often joke with my fellow congregants that if there were to be a test on the basic principles of Calvinism, probably 95% of the congregation would fail. And I'm just, because of your background, I haven't asked anybody else this question, so I thought I'd toss it at you and see if you thought there would be more of a knowledge base in an evangelical Lutheran church than maybe you might find in a Methodist church or a Baptist church.
Well, I think it depends on how much Christian education has happened through the years. But I think most churches, a good majority, would probably fail, depending on how deep it is. But they could probably tell you from preaching or from messages, yeah, that sounds Lutheran. No, that doesn't. So they're picking it up sometimes more by osmosis, perhaps.
Okay. I would agree. A complete twist, but this is a question we've been asking everybody, and I'll let you play around with it. We get different answers. What role do you see for churches and faith communities in cultivating a sense of citizenship in members?
I think our faith should lead us into deep engagement in the world around us. And so citizenship is a piece of that and is an important part of it. One of the great gifts as Lutherans that we have is a sense of a theology of vocation. When Luther and the other reformers, because it wasn't just him, were breaking away from the church at the time, there was this sense that vocation was a term only referring to religious vocations, clergy, monks, nuns, such. Luther and the others dispelled that notion. Vocation, and to be fair, John Calvin did too, that all Christians have not only one vocation, they have vocations. And so my first and foremost vocation is being as a baptized child of God and a disciple of Jesus. Then my vocations as a husband, father, pastor, on and on and on. And so, part of that is good citizenship. And so we pray every Sunday. We pray for leaders of the nations. We pray, on occasion, we'll include more specific prayers for the military, police, firefighters, first responders, and we certainly respect those roles. One thing as citizens as Christians, is to realize where our allegiances lie first. And so my allegiance first and foremost is to Jesus Christ, and then second to country and such. We tend to conflate God and country, and they aren't the same. And I think the danger in doing that is we lose the prophetic voice we can have. And so I think part of being a faithful, responsible citizen is sometimes calling out the political leaders when there's corruption, when there are problems and such. That's a piece that needs to be addressed as well from time to time. But faithful citizenship is part of our vocation as Christians in the world, is being engaged in our communities, in our country, in our...
So you definitely think that there is a connection between faith and citizenship?
There is.
Okay.
As I said, there is a danger sometimes when we say that, being a good Christian and being a good citizen are the same, or even worse yet, sometimes I think folks think that the only way to be a good Christian is to be a citizen of a particular political persuasion.
Right.
Not at all.
Right.
And so part of the role, I think, in the church, we need to keep a certain independence from the state so that we can have that prophetic voice. But that's also part of being engaging as a faithful citizen. And so, yes, we certainly have a role to play with that at the local level, beyond the local, state, national level. I think, for example, we need Christian folks serving in the military. We need those faithful folks serving well. Those are some really tough situations they're in.
Right.
I want somebody who's got that sense of ethics informed by their Christian faith, making those tough life and death decisions. Turned out it was not my calling in life, but that doesn't mean it can't be someone's.
Yeah, but you're the only person I can ask this question, I'll tell you, and so bear with me a minute.
Sure.
What role do you think that the military plays in this picture that you're describing?
I think the military is an instrument. It's an instrument that is to harness the violence of the state. I think it should be the way it should be used. That's a governmental function. That's the political leaders. There's a distinction, and this comes from my West Point training days, between jus ad bellum and jus in bello, justice to war and justice in war.
Right.
The justice going to war is primarily the function of the political leaders in making the decisions.
Right.
Yes, there are generals and such who have input into that. The military's role is how they apply the force within war. Rules of engagement and respecting non-combatants and those kinds of things. That's their role. So it certainly has a function and a role to play. I do think as Christians, our predilection should honestly be towards pacifism, towards nonviolence.
Okay.
Christ himself did not take up the sword.
Right.
But I'm also a realist in that. And so it's not that, I want good police around, because if somebody's coming and attacking my house, I want them to respond.
Yeah.
And so we need folks with that power and are trained to use it appropriately, and hopefully in as limited a fashion as possible. So.
Well, those are the only formal questions I have, but I always give my people I'm talking to an opportunity to add anything else they would like to that we may not have covered. So this is your opportunity to add any kind of postscript to this that you might like.
Sure. Well, my family and I are excited to be here in Muncie. It's been a real gift to us. This congregation has been a gift to us. We're enjoying the community. I'm excited to get more deeply engaged into the community in the years ahead. At this point, I've been first few months was spending really time getting to know the congregation. I've had lots of other responsibilities because I serve, as I said, on the board of directors at Trinity, but I'm also our stewardship director for our synod, so I'm out doing other things there. But in the years to come, I want to be more deeply engaged within this community. I believe God has real opportunities there are opportunities for resurrection and new life here in Muncie. And I'm excited to see where God will lead all of us in the years ahead, and hope that we at Holy Trinity can be a faithful partner in that process. So.
Do you, given the way your denomination works, do you have a kind of time frame when you come to a congregation like this in the Evangelical Lutheran Church?
We don't.
Okay.
The call process is, well, I mentioned it's managed from the synod level.
Right.
It's jointly discerned between the congregation and the potential pastor, rostered minister.
Right.
And so once the call is given, it's open-ended usually.
Okay.
There are rare circumstances where there'll be a term call for a couple of years, but it's an open call, and so we could be here 3 years. We could be here 30 years.
Okay.
Probably not too much longer just because of my age. But it's mutually discerned, and so it's open-ended to see where God leads us.
Okay. Thank you very much for your time. I appreciate it.
Well, thank you. I've enjoyed it. Thank you so much.